Now, the Montreal Canadiens have had a massive offseason, right? Clearly acquiring a stud defenseman and 25-year-old Noah Dobson. In order to get, you got to give. Emil Heineman goes the
Mhm.
other way. And the big dealings weren't done after Noah Dobson. Let's go to rg.org, where Marco D'Amico has the latest that came out last week. Logan Mailloux expands on the trade to St. Louis, heaps a lot of praise on the shoulders of the Montreal Canadiens organization, appeared to embrace local culture, which is something that really moves the needle in Quebec. So let's work through this quickly here. When you guys sat down with Logan Mailloux, what did he have to say about how he was developed within the Montreal Canadiens organization from a guy who said, please don't draft me. I've burned the right to be drafted. The Canadiens draft him, develop him, trade him to St.
Yeah.
Louis. What was the takeaway from Logan's perspective about how he was treated and developed within the organization?
Yeah, he had nothing but good things to say about the development staff and the time they took with them in Laval to really work on their skills and the communication between the coaching staff and the players and the organization and the players. Like we spent a good amount of time in terms of how they identified his weaknesses, the hard conversations they had with him, the plans that they set up to improve those weaknesses. And obviously he said it himself. He felt like he did significantly improved kind of as the season went on, and was one of the most, if not the most relied upon piece in the playoffs for the Laval Rocket until he sustained that injury. So to me, I think there was a lot of reconnaissance. Like he was cognizant of the work that was done with him. And at the end of the day, it's probably what's going to allow him to crack the roster in St. Louis is how he went about developing with the Canadiens and the Laval Rocket last season.
Mm-hmm. And they get obviously Zachary Bolduc, a young player who had worked hard and was a very valued member of that organization, and they're pushed towards a playoff berth, right?
Yep.
Now, what can you tell us about what St. Louis saw in Logan that they liked, that obviously greenlit the transaction, and what the Canadiens liked in Bolduc that made them comfortable giving up a guy? I didn't want to see them trade Logan Mailloux. I really didn't. I've been very
No,
consistent on that, but it's
I
over.
get
It's
you.
done with. So work me through that. What did the Blues see in Mailloux? What did the Habs see in Bolduc that the two teams were able to work this deal out?
Yeah, well, the Blues were on Mailloux's case for a while. That organization really feels like he is a surefire top four defenseman in the making. You heard Jim Montgomery say that he had top 10 talent at the time of his draft. Not something, it's not insane to think that based on his body of work as a 16-year-old leading up into his draft year. Obviously, it's arguable among scouts, but that's totally fine. In a situation where you just acquire a player, there's a PR sell job that needs to be made. St.
Yeah.
Louis is doing a fantastic job of that. So they were on Montreal's case in regards to Mailloux. I think the moment that a guy like Mailloux is somewhat made available or his name is out there, I think Chris Johnston was the insider that put out that he could possibly be available for trade. Well, the moment that happens, GMs see that, they call Kent Hughes and they're like, hey, what's going on? And so St. Louis obviously don't have a lot of young defensemen that are NHL ready, right? It's basically Philip Broberg that is the young aspect of that team. Torrey Krug is now going to have to retire, unfortunately. You have Cam Fowler, you have Parayko, you have Falk, all on the wrong side of 32 or about 32. So they need to get younger, faster. And right now, the defensemen that they've drafted, Adam Jiricek and Theo Lindstein, they're just not there yet. And so you needed a guy to come in, and especially a right shot. We've talked about this before, right shot defenseman, not as easy to come by over the last 5 drafts as they were in past years. So obviously there was interest there. And then from the Montreal Canadiens perspective, I mean, we kind of discussed this on a previous episode, but it's the skills that he brings, the dynamic that Bolduc brings, right? Obviously being as young as he is, they're the same age, Bolduc and Mailloux from the same draft. And Bolduc was also seen as a guy with top 15 talent that slid a little bit from what I was told, potentially also because he played in the QMJHL, and some scouts that were picking ahead, not a big fan of those leagues. So it created a situation where you got a potential two-way sniper in Bolduc for a potential top 4 defenseman. On paper, the right shot top four defenseman is generally worth more. But Bolduc has shown more in the NHL, so there was less risk in his acquisition. And again, the Canadiens, we can get into how the trade went down in a little bit, but the Canadiens wanted to identify a guy that brought a different element to their team. So puck retrieval, board battles, physicality, mean, has the shooting mechanics to be a threat at 5-on-5, on the penalty kill, on the power play, could play in all situations, and a guy that has experience playing center so that he can assist in taking left shot draws if need be. And ultimately, and I think this is the biggest key, he is what you call a forward one on the forecheck. So he's the guy that crashes into the net and calls all kinds of he's the one that causes all kinds of chaos. The Canadiens didn't have that kind of element in their lineup, and to draft one for them to get ready for this point didn't make much sense.
Yeah, but let me take you back to a statement that you made that I didn't disagree with. That if you weigh the winger versus a potential top four RD, I agree. I'll take the top four RD all day, every day, which brings me back to, I like Zachary Bolduc, but I'm going to take up the other side. I'll play devil's advocate for a second and argue that maybe this wasn't the best move, because everything you just described about Bolduc being F1, aggressive on the forecheck, blah, 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 blah. The Canadiens are still missing that on the back end. Like, I'll take you back to when they got to the Stanley Cup final with the defensemen they had. Who's going to be the nasty SOB that's going to clear the crease, that's going to go in the corner? I mean, Arbor Xhekaj is the easy answer, but he doesn't have the skill set to be a top four guy today. I don't think that's being disrespectful. So walk me through how your brain computes that. They're still missing a tough customer defensively that could play top four potentially, right?
I feel like a lot of people sleep on how tough Gouli could be. The only reason that people are a little low on that is just because of the injury history. And I don't blame him. But I feel like last season, he was exactly that, and he came back exactly at the right time and played through injury and was a tough SOB in those series as well. A little bit too tough in the Chicago game and almost cost the team, but solid nonetheless. And so I feel like outside of his crazy accidental leg laceration, he was relatively healthy last season. So I feel like outside of insanely bad luck, he should be fine. One guy that I think will answer your question, and I think some fans will kind of roll their eyes, but this is a guy that was actually pointed out by Logan himself, was David Reinbacher. David Reinbacher in the playoffs was clearing the garbage, was stick checking guys, was boxing them out in the corner. I wouldn't say he was nasty, but he was silently effective.
There where he was given it. I loved it. I loved it.
I know. I wouldn't say nasty per se. Like he wasn't dirty, but man, he plays players hard. And Logan actually took the time to really kind of highlight that and how you had David get meaner and stronger against his opponents as the playoffs went on. And he found that the fact that he was able to get into those games, that's probably going to carry over into his game. And so if you have Gouli, Reinbacher, Xhekaj, and I also state this because you always add certain physical elements to your roster when you're competitive and you're in the trade deadline and you throw a second round pick at a third pair of physical defensemen, like so many have done with Luke Schenn, for example, that you can just insert into your lineup at that point, that the priority should be filling out 1, 2, and 3 slots for your defenseman, which the Canadiens effectively did this summer in the Noah Dobson acquisition. Now you have Hudson, Dobson, Gouli. That's your 1, 2, 3. And then you eventually have Reinbacher as your 4, right? And then after that, your bottom pair, if you keep Xhekaj long-term, that's fantastic. You bring in another physical element, and then eventually you can move them up and down your lineup. But the idea is the core 4, for the Canadiens defense is set for the future. And I feel like they all bring a different element. And I don't necessarily there are a lot of people that downplay Noah Dobson's physicality. I remember Noah Dobson's physicality in the queue. I think he just needs the right setting to be able to bring that up. And playing for a team like Montreal that gets basically carried into war by Martin St. Louis, I'll be interested to see what he can do as well in that element. So when you bring in Dobson, when you have a Reinbacher, when you draft a couple of right shot defensemen in the 2025 draft, like Bryce Pickford, for example, who a lot of people are sleeping on, not everyone, but some, that you can allow yourself to move a guy like Mailloux. And I made a comment on TSN 690, in fact, where I wouldn't have traded prior to the Dobson trade. I wouldn't have traded Mailloux for anything less than a package for a top six center. And I'd like to go back to that because that Dobson trade changed the dynamic of the situation.
Okay, so can we get into the specifics of how the Canadiens got Zachary Bolduc? Because RG.org and the piece that Marco D'Amico wrote in Logan Mailloux speaking with Marco about the transaction, Quebec culture developed by the organization, how he appreciated how the team gave him reps. That's the only way to get better, is to get out there and do it and do it and do it. RG.org reporting that the Canadiens were dealing with a couple of different teams, but it was the Bolduc that was the more intriguing. So it was surprising to me. Can you clarify, was a center at all talked about, whether it's St. Louis or anybody else? Was anyone else talking to Montreal about, here's a center, we want Logan Mailloux? Walk me through what the Canadiens were dealing with and whether or not there was maybe a bidding war of sorts.
So the Canadiens were obviously looking for a center. They were talking to teams, trying to see if they can make a deal. I don't think they were interested in Marco Rossi, but I did hear of them trying to poke around and see if there would be any available. Obviously, no top six center was traded this summer, right? For obvious reasons. And so it created a situation where I don't think there was anything available. And the idea was, if they weren't going to have room for Logan and they were going to just leave him in Laval, there was a risk that his value could potentially drop next season if he doesn't take the next step, right? A prospect that stagnates or a prospect that stays at the same level, even if there is improvement, the value doesn't necessarily go up because the progression curve isn't sharp. And so they had a decision to make where it was like, okay, well, we have this trade chip and we have other needs in our lineup and we need to improve in certain elements. And it was definitely getting more top six talent, right? And I feel like they needed a young top six talent, but not so young as to have to wait 3 years for them to actually hit their stride. So the Canadiens were talking to a few teams. I know a couple of Western Conference teams that were, hot on his trail for a while now. I know that Anaheim had interest back in the day as well. They almost traded for Mailloux when it came to Trevor Zegras. But St. Louis had made the call that they were interested. They had talked about different elements. Obviously, there was the Jordan Kyrou trade discussions as well, and they had poked a little bit of tires there to see what was going on. But ultimately, there was no deal to be made at the time with Kyrou before his no trade kicked in, and the interest in Logan Mailloux persisted. And so the Canadiens didn't value, there's this thing I saw online that the Canadiens valued Bolduc more than they valued Kyrou. That's not the case at all. They appreciate both players, but I think we can all agree that the consistent 70-point forward is probably, exactly. So, when it comes to the way that the Bolduc thing came around, is the Canadiens asked for him and the Blues said no. And ultimately, on July 1st, Logan told us that his agent had called him in the morning to say, you're going to be traded today. We don't know where.
Yeah.
But you're going to be traded today, which leads me to believe the Canadiens had set themselves that time. They wanted to see on July 1st, after teams had, I wouldn't say struck out on free agency because we're not supposed to talk about tampering on this channel. But after teams had figured out that they wouldn't be able to go after certain players because those players were going to sign with other teams or were no longer available, like, for example, Aaron Ekblad signing with the Florida Panthers, right? There goes a right shot defenseman. Cody Ceci ultimately ending up to sign with LA. There goes another right shot defenseman. So once that market was kind of zapped, they were like, okay, well, maybe we go the young way. And they had just drafted Justin Carbonneau, who impressed greatly at camp. And so you bring about these elements. And so the Blues they felt like they had no choice but to pay up for a player that they held in high esteem. And the Canadiens continued to ask for Zach Bolduc. And so ultimately the call was made from Doug Armstrong going, fine, we'll do it. And that's what ultimately, like, they were getting a young, established player that could potentially play center, but was more likely going to play wing, that brought a different element to their team that would otherwise, down the line when this player is going to be in his prime, would otherwise cost them far more than what Logan Mailloux is worth right now, with the risk, or with the idea that there is a risk that maybe Mailloux could be a top 4 defenseman down the line, like he could be a bottom pair defenseman, like he could bust. And that applies to all prospects. I'm not specifically talking about him, but there is less risk in Zachary Bolduc because he can play multiple roles, so young of a player, and was already at I think it was a 23 goal or 24 goal pace as a rookie. Give that consistent power play time throughout the season, more 5-on-5 minutes, and better general line mates, because he mostly played on a third line with Jake Neighbors.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And who himself is going through a little bit of a funk as well after a good rookie season. And I think there's potential to continue to evolve. And then eventually, him and Demidov on the same line. Could you imagine Demidov setting up a guy with the release that Bolduc has? So the Canadiens saw the value. Obviously, there was the local element as well that was a bonus, not a prerequisite, but a bonus. And that created a situation where the Canadiens were just like, hey, what are the chances we get a better offer than this? And if we hold off on this, is it going to create, is Bolduc not going to become available anymore, or are they going to look elsewhere to make a trade? So the Canadiens felt like this was a solid bang for their buck, and eventually made the trade. So a couple of hours after Logan had received a call from his agent, he got a call from Kent Hughes to say that he was traded to St. Louis.
And I saw in the article that you wrote breaking down the Mailloux for Bolduc trade at rg.org, I'll link it in the video description here, that he was chilling with friends, having lunch and waiting for the call. Did you ask him what he was having for lunch? Or like Mandy salad or like poutine or something?
No.
These are the questions I want answers to. These are the questions that are interesting to me.
That's fine. It's Canada Day. What do you think he's having?
Probably Mandy salad. I would guess a Mandy salad. He's a professional athlete.
He was in Windsor. I don't know that.
I don't have no idea. I've never been to Windsor. I know it's close to Detroit. Last parting thought on this. Last question on this. I'm a big fan of infrastructure, having the right people in the right places doing the right work. Obviously, Gordon and Hughes, it starts there, down to Martin St. Louis, right man at the right time. It looked and it appears that Rob Ramage had quite the impact on Logan Mailloux. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, so Rob Ramage obviously had reached out to Mailloux even before the Canadiens had drafted him.
Yeah.
So that goes to show you. But Rob Ramage had his own past, obviously, that he had come back from and kind of been able to turn into a positive.
Exactly.
And that's fantastic for him. And I feel like obviously with Logan's situation at the time, he needed kind of a support person to kind of show him the way to being able to correct certain wrongs, and being able to in doing so sustainably make himself a more centered and understanding person in what happened. So what first started off as an initial phone call turned into a friendship. And I mean, like, this is a player that was suspended in the OHL. This is a player who got injured in his second year in the OHL. So he didn't really get much playing time. And so during those downtimes, there's a lot of hockey psychology that kind of goes into this. And Ramage was a crutch that he was able to lean on in those situations where he was able to give himself a little bit of leeway to kind of understand the situation and, basically recenter himself and continue to work through the adversity. So from that personal perspective, and he's not the only one that said this to me, like Shaun Farrell has said this to me. Lane Hudson has said this to me when it comes to a guy like Ramage. So, he's been influential in helping these players along on the developmental side when it comes to the personal aspects of their development. And I feel like that's a massive boost for the organization, the fact that he's so available for these players. And obviously, very familiar with the St. Louis area. So probably someone that's going to stop in and see Logan a couple of times. But Logan had nothing but great things to say about him, the development staff with Frankie Bouillon, and obviously the skills development coach and Adam Nicholas and all that. Yep. And, your boy Paul Byron as well. And so what's up, Paul? And so obviously, like, these are all elements that have done really well for the Canadiens youth, because he's not the first one that's told me this. David Reinbacher spoke about it a little bit when I interviewed him in April, but it really goes to show that the Canadiens have kind of turned the corner in terms of the investment that they make personally and from a skills perspective in their players. So like it's undeniable the impact that Rob Ramage had on Logan Mailloux's trajectory. And, obviously that development, as unemotional as this may sound, that development is what allowed the Canadiens to bring up a guy like Mailloux, despite all of those lost reps, and turn him into an asset like Zach Bolduc, who's going to be able to help the team for years and years and years.
That's Marco D'Amico. You can follow him at MN D'Amico. And again, I'll link that piece he wrote in the interview with Logan Mailloux in the video description down below. And of course, follow along at MN D'Amico with RG Media.